So good morning, everybody. My name's Sue Tansey, and I work for a company called iCAN. And you've just heard from Cindy what a contract research organisation is. iCAN was composed of Quintiles, which was a contract research organisation, and just under 2 years ago we combined with a human data science company, so going back to what Steph was talking about earlier, a company called IMS, and we changed our name last October to iCAN. So I thought I'd just explain that to start off with. I'm a doctor working in a CRO. I actually started off my life as a paediatrician, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my background before I joined the pharmaceutical industry and what I've done since I've been in industry, because I'm going to talk about careers in the pharmaceutical industry today. First of all, I just want to explain what I do in my job at the moment. I'm actually in charge of what we call therapeutic strategy for a few therapeutic areas. So that covers respiratory, allergy, infectious disease and vaccines, and women's health. And so what I do is when pharmaceutical companies, as Claudia was talking about earlier, have a drug that they want to take through clinical trials, those organisations may come to a CRO to ask them to help them out. And I will then, and my team, we will look at those clinical trials, which can vary from companies that are not used to doing clinical trials to companies that are very used to doing clinical trials. And we will look at how they plan to do the trials and advise them. And perhaps, as Cindy was saying, you know, if they're not used to doing trials in children, we will perhaps say, well, we think you should do this slightly differently to make sure that the trials are done in the best way possible to get to the results that will mean that that drug gets on the market, and also, you know, from a pharmaceutical company point of view, get it to market so that they can then have it available to the public. So, and then the other thing I just wanted to explain is my title, which links a little bit to what I'm going to say about my background and how I got to do the job that I'm doing now. Way back when I was at school, I liked chemistry, and what I really liked about chemistry was when we used to write up the experiments that we were doing. So you'd start off with your theory, why you were going to do it, and then how you were going to do it, and then eventually you get to your results. And I actually think that I've come full circle, because nowadays a clinical trial, it's the same sort of process in a much bigger way, that you're planning what you're doing, and that's what a lot of my job is at the moment, but eventually you get to the results, which is the really exciting bit. So anyway, I'm going to try and be fairly quick, because I know that you're all keen to get to the break, but you know, I'm going to run through my background and then just talk a little more generally about, you know, why I went into industry, what skills you need to be in industry, and some of the other jobs.
It's the big one.
Green one. Sorry about that, they didn't teach me how to change slides, unfortunately. And now I've gone too far. So, as I've just mentioned at school, one of my favourite subjects was chemistry, the other was maths. I had a relative who was a doctor, and I really didn't feel that I wanted to do a desk job. I didn't want to go into an office every day, 9 o'clock, sit at the same desk all day. I then went to university, did a course with preclinicals, that's the scientific part of medicine, and then the clinical course. And I went into paediatrics because I'd really enjoyed doing paediatrics, looking after children in my training, so I started to train in that. I wanted to specialise particularly in respiratory paediatrics and in looking after premature babies in neonatology. And then I did a research post. And that started to, you know, educate me about clinical trials a little more, and I got really interested in it. So at that point, that's when I decided to join industry to see what it was like doing clinical trials in industry. And 20 years later, I'm still here. When I started off, I was working in cardiovascular trials, so trials in things like new drugs for high blood pressure, drugs for angina, because at that time, that's what a lot of the research was in. So although I would have liked to work in trials in children, there weren't that many happening 20 years ago. But the good thing was that I had the opportunity to learn about some of the things we've learned about this morning, some of the other areas, about safety, pharmacovigilance, and about the regulatory aspects. So although I didn't decide to go into those areas, I knew about them and had that experience. I then went into vaccine research because at that time, a lot of the vaccines being developed were for children. So that was one way of getting into trials that were a bit more linked to my clinical background. And I worked on the pneumococcal vaccine, Prevnar 13, which I would imagine a lot of you had in your immunisations when you were younger. The first two jobs I had were in pharmaceutical companies, as Claudia was talking about earlier. But then I went to a consultancy, which was just a group of physicians and other people helping companies, a little bit like a CRO. And then I've moved into CROs for my last two jobs. Initially was in a specific paediatric job, but now I cover, as I've mentioned, a few therapeutic areas. But the change that's really happened in industry over those 20 years, there's a lot more children's trials happening, from the fact that the laws changed requiring companies to look at medicines in children, which is a really good thing because obviously, you know, we need to check that they're safe and that they work properly in children. So, you know, it's really emphasising the changing environment, along with the fact that I started off in cardiology, whereas nowadays that's not necessarily where a lot of the research is, because we've got lots of drugs for high blood pressure. We don't necessarily need new drugs, but we do need drugs for lots of rare diseases and some of the diseases that we see a lot in children. Why did I go into the industry? Well, I was very interested, as I mentioned, in the clinical trial process, and I'd seen in my clinical practice the need for new medicines, but also I'd seen really exciting drugs being developed. When I was starting to work in neonatology, I saw a surfactant being developed for use in premature babies. So for those of you who don't know what a surfactant is, in premature babies, unlike newborn full-term babies that have a lining in their lungs, a fluid lining their lungs that stops them from collapsing, babies that are born early don't necessarily have enough or sufficient, the good enough quality of that surfactant to stop the lungs from collapsing. So I was involved in the first trials of the surfactant back in, I think it was about 1990, where we were giving that to premature babies, and that has resulted in a lot more premature babies surviving. So it's really changed the environment of treating premature babies. And the other drug that I saw being used when I worked in children with cystic fibrosis was DNAs, which subsequently to that, there have been a lot more new medicines for cystic fibrosis. I think you heard earlier this week. DNAs was used to loosen the thick mucus that children with cystic fibrosis have in their lungs, making them more susceptible to having lots of chest infections. And again, that was a real new type of drug to treat those children with that condition. So I was really excited by those kind of things, interested to learn new things. I saw that I could impact more patients than perhaps I could as a doctor looking after individual patients. And also there were things like the opportunity to travel. I worked for a French company, so I got to learn French, better than I already spoke it, still not very good. And every day is different, and I think that's still, in my job now, 20 years later, you never know what's going to happen. It's a little bit like that as a doctor in clinical practice, but I still see that in industry. These are some of the skills that I think you need for a career in the pharmaceutical industry, quite similar to being a doctor, I think, in a hospital too. But, for people, even the people that aren't working as physicians, I'll mention some of the other roles you can have in industry in a second. Team working, being interested in science and wanting to learn more, solving problems, and I think this comes back to my like of mathematics when I was at school. I used to enjoy solving mathematical problems, and we get lots of problems with clinical trials. Part of my job is to try and minimise the problems that we get by anticipating them, but still you can't always see what's going to happen. So every day we're trying to sort of solve any issues that come up. Multitasking, flexibility, able to adapt to change, as I've mentioned, and just to like interacting with people, I think is very important. So I don't think I need to spend much time on this because I think we've already learnt the difference between a pharmaceutical company and a CRO. But looking at the list of roles that are within a CRO, I think starts to give an example of the kind of jobs that you can do in the pharmaceutical industry. So it's by no means just physicians. You don't have to be a doctor at all. And in fact, many of the jobs that people that aren't doctors do in industry are very, very similar, actually. I'm working with people every day that have backgrounds as scientists, statisticians, etc. So clinical research assistants is often the job that people come to first when they join the pharmaceutical industry. And they're really important. They're at the, what we say, the coal face of the clinical trial. They're at the sites, they're setting up the study, they're making sure all the equipment's at the site, they're training the site staff in the clinical trial process and visiting the site regularly throughout the trial. So they have to be really good at communication, and really organised, and there's quite a bit of travel involved in that as well. Project managers are sort of looking at the overall project, making sure it's carried out on time as much as possible, that recruitment's happening as it should do. I've mentioned the role of the doctor. People that work in the regulatory startup process at the beginning of the study to make sure we've got all the permissions needed to start the study. Data managers. I haven't got on here data scientists actually, but Steph reminded me with her talk, particularly in my company where we've got a lot of data abilities. We've got data scientists and statisticians, and I think statisticians have a very interesting job and a very important job when we're looking at the results of the study, as well as planning it at the beginning. This is just really the main categories of jobs within the pharmaceutical industry, but I've really been focusing mainly on the research and development. But there are, of course, as Claudio mentioned, there's jobs in manufacturing, both investigational product and later the marketed product. The commercial side of it, because in drugs there needs to be sort of development of advertisements in some cases, not in the UK, and also the paperwork that goes with the drug, etc. So there's training of the sales reps, etc. And support functions, of course, you need IT, catering, as you would for any company. So moving on to research and development, I've already run through some of the roles that you can have in the pharmaceutical industry. But here just emphasising, even as a doctor, there's lots of different parts of the process that Claudio described that you can work in, the very early phase right through to the commercial side. Scientists can be found in lots of different areas in the pharmaceutical industry, from working in laboratories, setting up the way to measure the level of drug within the blood, which is very important in the early studies. They can be working the preclinical bit, so that's in the testing in animals before you go to test the drug in humans. In formulating the drug, and what that means is what Cindy was mentioning earlier, making sure that the drug is in the right form for the child and also for the disease, because in some diseases it would be fine to take a medicine a couple of times a day. In other cases, in very small children, you might want to have a solution and you might only want to take it once a day because you don't want to be going into school to give the medicine. So there's lots of different formulations and things to work on there. Pharmacists, again, they can be found in all different areas. We've talked about data managers and CRAs. So finally, I just wanted to mention a really good resource for any of you that are interested in working in the pharmaceutical industry in any of these roles or any part of the process, and that's the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry, the ABPI. Now that's obviously a UK organisation, but I I think a lot of what you would find on the website will be very applicable to those of you from other countries. There's a lot of information there. You can order leaflets, and their website is at the bottom, the careers.abpi.org.uk. So please, go and have a look at that website, and you'll find lots more information.